This is the best of First and Last, the podcast.
Last night, as the Clippers lose in Game 7, it's our only Game 7 of the first round between the Utah Jazz and the Clippers. Utah wins 104-91. And no disrespect to the Clippers, who will go on and seem to be the general consensus now that going forward, they're going to give Golden State the best game in the next round. They're a team with a greater depth. Their bench should really outpace the Clippers at every turn during this series. But they don't really seem to be the story here. Everyone looking at this situation now looks immediately as that reporter did. Now reporters seem to, especially during this NBA playoff run, have seemed to be made to feel great shame for the questions that they ask, even when they are the questions you are obligated to ask on this side of the fence, as we often hear. But Chris Paul has been here for none of that over the course of the playoffs. But that being said, it's exactly where this is going to go now, which is, what does this mean for this current Clippers roster? Because we hear on the outside everyone wants to blow this up, but we know that there's outs for these players. Blake Griffin is going to be a free agent coming up this summer. Chris Paul does have that termination clause, the way so many guys do leading up to this summer, where we know there's another cap jump on the way. And it makes you wonder, okay, what's next for him? And so for the sake of playing something I find interesting again, let's delve back into this exchange between Chris Paul and the reporter bold enough to ask the hard-hitting question in the postgame for the Clippers.
Hey, Chris, I feel obligated to at least ask, have you given any consideration to your early termination option?
No, I haven't. We just lost probably 20 minutes ago.
All right, so still obligated to ask.
Yeah, it's obligated.
You're Chris Paul, obligated. And on the player side, you never really understand that. You know everyone has a job, but you don't really buy into it that the same way you do sitting over here now. Like when I was a player, I would have absolutely looked at that guy sideways, be like, what kind of idiot question is that? The way Chris Paul has made it very clear he views it as. We'll make that Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless. Best phones, best networks, half the cost. Straight Talk Wireless, nationwide coverage on America's largest and most dependable networks. And our own Mark Spears from ESPN's The Undefeated says the Clippers do have a tough task in trying to keep Chris Paul on this roster.
The Clippers have to prove to him that they can win. Can they go after a Paul George? Can they go after a Carmelo Anthony? Do they keep Blake Griffin here? All those things are going to factor in what Chris Paul decides to do. It's inevitable that the Clippers are going to give him money. They're going to give him years, probably 5 years, but will he stay? The way he stays is making sure that this franchise is still a winner.
And so that's where it gets interesting, is it becomes kind of the same conversation that we had about Paul George in Indiana, where there it had been, especially with the All-NBA clause contingent, they would be able to offer him more money under the CBA, try to give these hometown teams a chance to keep their players around, but they can offer him $200+ million over the life of that. Chris Paul will get over $200 million over that 5 years if he stays with the Clippers, and it becomes this weird space that exists seemingly, I guess it exists in a lot of lines of work, but it comes up more often in sports, which is, when is enough financially for guys that are looking to add that championship element to their resume? And that becomes it with Chris Paul. You look at him over the life of his career, he's played in 76 career playoff games, the most all-time by a player without a conference finals appearance. So forget the best who never win a championship argument. Chris Paul, for as much as we laud him for being a uniquely talented player at his position, it entered the game last night, shooting, with the 50-40-90 line, field goal percentage, 3-point percentage, free throw percentage, 27.3 points a game, 10 assists per game. Had been great, had been everything that this team needed him to be along the way, and yet it's consistently not been enough. So when is enough for him on his end? Because everyone's going to talk about this from the angle of the Clippers blowing it up. And our own Antonio Davis, ESPN NBA analyst, talked about that just on the Clippers side of things, what they need to do breaking this team up potentially.
When you talk about the Clippers, yes, I think you have to blow this team up. it's just not a team that works for what they're doing now in today's game. You can either have Chris Paul and DeAndre Jordan because you got a great pick-and-roll combo. Then you need a guy who can stretch the floor. Or you have to get rid of – you keep Blake and get rid of Chris Paul and DeAndre for some reason. But I don't think you can keep those three. Those three guys don't work in the system that goes on today.
And it has always seemed like an awkward fit, but more than anything, it's been a fit that really never had time to get roots because of the constant looming presence of injury for any of these guys, but mainly Blake Griffin, a guy who, the last two postseasons has found his year cut short by injury. And so you wonder, on that side, do the Clippers make a change? But I've always disputed, and this is something I've gotten a lot more recently as a Notre Dame fan, people who look at the situation from the outside, and Brian Kelly's been there 7 years now, and say, well, why are you going to be okay with the up and downs that we've seen through there? And as someone who's been through a coaching change, there's nothing worse than change for change's sake on the outside looking in, because those are ugly, ugly growing pains that you've got to go through every time you rip that Band-Aid off and start over again. But when you look at it on the player side, if you're Chris Paul, if you're Blake Griffin, do you want to come back to this knowing what you've got to face in the Western Conference with Golden State sitting right there, knowing the perennial power the San Antonio Spurs have been, knowing you've got a chance? I mean, Dwayne Wade came out the other day and said, I don't have to ring chase, but I can, referencing what he's got coming up as far as a decision this summer. But he's already got his. These are guys that are still looking to cement their legacy in a way that really we only allow a championship to do. And so if you're those players, would you come back? If you're Chris Paul, I know he doesn't want to answer it there and then, but if you're Chris Paul, why are you not looking out and saying, you know what? Maybe San Antonio, maybe that Riverwalk does look a little nice. Aging backcourt there, a guy who's a budding top 2 or 3 player in the league, and Kawhi Leonard, who really seemed to round into finally getting the respect he deserves in that conversation. Go play with that guy, LaMarcus Aldridge, and a core that could be together for a while here and have a pretty decent amount of success.
Do you think Chris Paul will get the same sort of vitriol that Durant got if he did something like join the Spurs, like a ready-made championship contender?
I don't think so, just because I don't think we view Chris Paul the same way we do Kevin Durant as one of the 2 or 3 best players in the world. I mean, we've had to argue for his place as one of the 2 or 3 best point guards in the league at certain times. And so I think if you're not that guy, and also we've got this weird line where in someone's career are we comfortable with them going and ring chasing? Like, does it feel like Chris Paul is in the absolute prime of his career, the same way Kevin Durant has been viewed now? And he was coming off a season where he had been up 3-1 on a team in a conference finals. He had been to an NBA final, so he had shown he can get there. We haven't seen that from Chris Paul on his own. So is he a guy that skill-wise we're comfortable enough? Chris Paul's been in the league since 2005, so this is a guy who's been here quite a while doing it at a level, and now I feel like we'd be much more comfortable with him. We've got that point of diminished return for everyone. For a guy who actually, this works out perfectly, because for a guy who had some teammates that were a part of this very conversation, and Paul Pierce, who played his last NBA game last night, going into retirement, we'll have a whole separate conversation about him coming up, but his teammates and Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen that joined him looking for a ring. We had I was filling on Rousseau and Cannell. We had Chauncey Billups on to tell a story about how him and one other player were basically involved in having that conversation with Kevin Garnett and saying, you need to get out of Minnesota. He said, KG's a really loyal guy. They told him, you need to go here and get that ring. And we were okay with it more so because of that point in the career he was at.
First and last, the podcast.
I want to clarify something here, because we're going to have the conversation about Paul Pierce. Last night, or yesterday, I should say, not last night, the Clippers were eliminated, and in that, Paul Pierce played his final NBA game in his career, and the conversation immediately goes to, all right, well, congratulations to Paul Pierce. Next stop, the Hall of Fame for him. Seems to be a no-brainer. So no one's saying that Paul Pierce isn't going to get into the Hall of Fame. But we come in this morning getting ready. JBT's our resident Celtics fan. I've been getting chirped all weekend, because after the Celtics went down those first 2 games to the Bulls in that series, I came on here and buried them, and rightly so. And I will put an asterisk up there and say the Rondo injury really threw things off for me a little bit there. But that being said, they've won 5 straight since then. Had a great opening showing yesterday as well in the second round of the Eastern Conference playoffs, ran the Wizards. So we came in this morning, I figured, JBT would be all aboard the Paul Pierce for Hall of Fame trail. Not so fast. James.
I just feel like he was All-NBA second team once in his career. So that's 1 year of his 15-year career. He was a top 10 NBA player. I feel like if you're not consistently considered a top 5, 10 NBA player, I just don't think that's a Hall of Fame resume.
Does being the Finals MVP not? Because I feel like that's sort of the get out of jail free card for most guys with the NBA. Or is your beef with the larger idea that just the Hall of Fame and the NBA in general lets too many people in?
That's another thing. Like, judging by who they let in, Paul Pierce should definitely be a Hall of Famer. There's many people in the Hall of Fame he has a far better resume than, but that's a completely different argument.
Yeah, so I guess that's where it would really have to go is what's the standard you're judging off of. Like, for me, it seemed like a no-brainer. Like, as you said, for the All-NBA teams, yeah, he'd had that, but he'd been a 10-time All-Star, which I understand is a different sort of set of criteria based on who's voting for that and who's judging on that. But it's still like it's one of those you either know or you don't, right? That's usually the general like eye test criteria everyone wants to throw out. Because statistically for Paul Pierce, when you look at the only all-time leaderboard he really registers on would be points. He's 15th all-time in points with 26,397. And for comparison, so one of the 3 players left from the 98 draft class, that was Paul Pierce until last night. Now it's just Vince Carter and Dirk Nowitzki. Paul Pierce outpaces Vince Carter by 7 spots on this list. He's right around 2,000 points above him on that list for comparison. I mean, Vince Carter seems like another one, lock Hall of Famer for him whenever he decides to hang it up. And he actually just came out and said he's trying to play. His goal is another 2 years in the league. So 40-year-old Vince Carter content to keep going, but that seems to be, I don't know, for me it seemed to be a no-brainer. We'll throw it out to you guys too, 888-729-3776. Let's go to John in Massachusetts. John, you're on first and last. What's going on?
Hi, Mike Golic Jr. It's nice to talk to you. Thank you for taking my call. I wanted to say, Paul Pierce, a lot of people probably don't remember that he was stabbed in a Boston bar before he even played for the Celtics and had a whole bunch of stitches all over his face and was still tough enough to play that year. And he's a warrior. I went to the last game of the season before they got Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen. They were playing the Pistons and they got clobbered. He came out at halftime and on crutches and told everybody in the crowd they were going to win next year. And I was laughing. I'm not a big Celtics fan. I was always a Laker fan, and ever since then I've been rooting for the Celtics. And the next year I went to the first game when they played the Wizards, and Gilbert Arenas said he was going to score 50 points and beat the Celtics. And the Celtics, Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, and Ray Allen, and Rondo, and Posey, and all those guys knocked him down, and then and Gilbert Arenas was never the same. And I always believed Paul Pierce since then. I mean, it was amazing what he said and did. And thank you for taking my call.
Yeah, we appreciate the call, and
John just out here attributing the end of Gilbert Arenas' career to one game against the Celtics.
Yeah, how about that for the downfall there? The downfall of the Celtics all traced back to that one moment and the toughness factor of being stabbed before that.
I want to see that on Paul Pierce's Hall of Fame resume. Like when we put up graphics and we have the conversation on ESPN television, it's like Paul Pierce resume ended Gilbert Arenas' career.
I feel like that's worth enough.
I was at that game against the Pistons he referenced where he came out at halftime and made the speech. He was not on crutches. He was faking an injury because they were trying to tank. He was just chilling in a sweater vest. He was perfectly healthy.
Probably need to stay woke on that one. Just a little bit. And for me, yeah, listen, Paul Pierce is a guy that's probably going to get some of that toughness lauded at him, but I will never escape the visual in my entire life of him going off the court with a shoulder injury in the wheelchair. Like, people will not forget that, and rightly so. I won't forget that. That was one of those anti-tough moments, and we'll get to his former team in a little bit. One guy playing down a tooth last night, something that, Dan, I know as a hockey fan, you could appreciate. A little more run-of-the-mill on that side of the street.
I'm a little surprised he's not out for the playoffs, to be honest with you. I thought, basketball players lost tooth. Like, that's it. It's a wrap.
It seemed to be a nice running joke. I always love the visual of the guy going and picking up his own tooth. Always much more impressive when a guy can find it on the ice, though, considering the color there. But that being said, still impressive, and Isaiah Thomas's whole playoff run has been impressive for a host of other reasons. But regardless, that toughness gets part of the conversation. For Paul Pierce, too, I think a lot of it helps that he represents, anytime we brought up the old NBA guard, he was one of those guys still currently in the league you could bring up to support those arguments of toughness and loyalty. I mean, outside of the 2013 plus portion of his career where it started to just bounce around after they blew up that Celtics big three, you had a guy who had been a lifer for his current team who was the one that courted these other guys to his squad. So he didn't have to leave to ring chase. He stayed right there and seemingly brought that championship to Boston in a way that people really appreciated, especially in that city.
JBT just brought up an interesting point, though. His Wikipedia picture, Paul Pierce, Wizards jersey.
Wow, I just saw that.
What are we doing, Wikipedia?
How do you let that happen?
Someone needs to go in there and fix that. Paul Pierce is a Celtic. Let's be clear.
That's the problem with leaving things open to the public domain too much, is that we can't handle nice things all the time. We've proven that over and over again. Once we were handed the internet, we proved we are not better. We were not better than making Paul Pierce a lifetime wizard on Wikipedia. Just doesn't work that way.
First and last.
An unbelievable run from the Boston Celtics after a 16-0 run to start the game by the Wizards. Of course, in my continued vendetta to be wrong talking about the Boston Celtics this postseason, said that going into this one seemed like a no-brainer. John Wall, for my money, probably can make an argument he's the best point guard in the Eastern Conference. Guy so gifted athletically. We spent last week talking about him in comparison to Russell Westbrook as far as physical gifts, the ability to get up and down the court in between the foul lines to finish at the rack. And instead, last night, Isaiah Thomas, who through everything he has gone through this season, through just maybe being criminally underrated in general because of his size, all of those different things coming to a head, goes out and drops 33 last night in a win for them that outside of that first quarter run, that initial run to start the game by the Wizards that, James, you were there for it. I mean, completely deflating to begin that game, and yet somehow was willing and able to drag this team out of it.
I never thought I'd hear a playoff game that silent at any home arena. It was, the 16-0 start. It was so deflating, and it kind of just built its way back, and it was awesome in the end.
If you can't get excited, it's bad when people aren't excited when they bust out the T-shirt cannon. If you can break that out and if that doesn't move the needle for anyone, you really found yourself into a dark, dark hole.
Yeah, they run that out. They're having all these fun little things in the Jumbotron, and everybody's just kind of sitting there, looking down at their laps as the team's down 16-0. And, they've subbed out Al Horford and they've subbed out the good players. You got Kelly Olynyk in there trying to create a spark. They're just trying to do anything to get them going.
Kelly Olynyk, and still trying to figure out desperately what he's doing on his chin with that facial hair there. But someone that's trying to figure out what Isaiah Thomas has been doing through the face of adversity has been his coach, Brad Stevens, who talked about just that last night.
I've said it before. I've just been in continual amazement the last couple of weeks with his ability to function on the basketball court and excel on the basketball court. And today's just another chapter of that. Just amazed.
And amazed at him hearing of himself. Let's hear from Isaiah Thomas, who's amazed at how this team has fought through adversity during this postseason as well.
We know it's not going to be, peaches and cream all the time. And we always play with our backs against the wall. So tonight we definitely didn't want to be down 16-0, but it happens, and we locked in even more. We settled down. We executed our offense, and we got stops. That's how we got back in the game.
Peaches and cream. Is that a phrase? Is that something people pretty commonly use to describe that?
I've definitely heard it before.
We're having a debate in the control room because when I heard him say that, I was like, what's he talking about? JBT's like, no, I've heard that. No, peaches and cream. And I've never heard anyone use the phrase, it's not always peaches and cream. I have no idea what that means.
Well, I think it's pretty clear what it means.
Okay, Golic. Contextually speaking, I get it, but it doesn't make any sense.
I feel like I've heard that as a thing people say before. I feel like that's pretty
I'm outnumbered
commonplace.
here?
Yeah, I have a
That's a thing?
That could, I mean, you being outnumbered on this show is probably going to be a thing going forward, too.
Put it on the poll.
Oh, no. Oh, no. Guillermo's somewhere cringing right now. Billy, I'm so sorry for what you just had to hear there. But regardless of that, Isaiah Thomas does bring up a good point, is that this is a team that going into the playoffs, we just buried from the absolute get-go, said they're the worst one seed we had seen in a long time, just started just absolutely getting this team out before we could even get them in. They go down 2-0 to the Bulls. It becomes an even easier thing, to the point where brilliant people get up and find their way onto the air and talk about how that series is going to be a sweep. And in the end, now the Bulls have rattled off, was it 5 straight games at this point? 5 straight wins for them in the postseason. And it's really hard to tell that story without telling the story about Isaiah Thomas and what he's overcome with the loss of his sister earlier in the playoffs. Talked about the fact that everything he does from here on out is going to be from her, and you just can't account for those unique motivating factors in sports. And it's tough because you never know how much to attribute to those things. You never know how much of the early struggles of this team were tied to the fact that you were just dealing with a group where your superstar player, and right now the face of your franchise, was going through something that we all, for the most part, can't and don't want to ever think about fathoming. But Isaiah Thomas, as far as his postseason legend that starts to grow now, got to add to that a little bit last night with the tooth being knocked out. The incident there, coming around, coming off a screen, catching an elbow right to the mouth, and we've now all seen the imaging of the tooth flying out of his mouth, him walking over to pick it up. Here's Isaiah Thomas describing getting that tooth knocked out.
My tongue goes right through my tooth, so I've never had dental problems, so this is new. I've always had teammates that I will always clown them about their tooth being out. Now I'm one of them, so hopefully we can replace it as soon as possible.
Dan, someone also just tweeted into it was Eric Hall tweeted in, Draymond Green used the term peaches and cream during the finals last year. So I have a feeling you're slowly going to start to get buried on this.
I think what fans of this show will realize is that I'm not hip at all.
No,
I'm like the oldest 27-year-old you'll ever meet in your entire life.
Yeah, something about producers on this show being young old men is slowly becoming a trend. But yeah, Dan is definitely out on that one. I have a feeling we're going to have a bump back song for you, Dan, that's going to blow your mind coming up here pretty soon. We got a good one coming up here. Let's go to Sid in Alabama for a second. Sid, you're on First and Last. Mike Oak Jr., what's going on?
Yeah, first off, great point about the T-shirt cannon. I mean, if that doesn't get you excited, what will? But I'm here to ask about what is your favorite Pop-Tart flavor, because I think wild berry is number one.
You know what? I would definitely co-sign that to an extent. I think you can't get too far away from the original flavors when you're talking about the best Pop-Tart. I'm probably still a brown cinnamon sugar guy myself, but I'll allow that one. And Sid, just in the interest of our conversation here, peaches and cream, is that a phrase that you've ever used before? Is that something you've heard?
I'm just going to pile on to Dan and say yes, I have heard it.
Hey, I like that mentality. Pile on to Dan, 888-729-3776 if you would like to join in the party, and just pile on Dan Z for not understanding common vernacular.
18 votes in the ESPN radio Twitter poll, so obviously we've reached that threshold where it's officially scientific. 65%. No, that is not a phrase people use.
Really? All right. The early return's not looking good for us right now, but we're going to ignore those results because they don't back up our point and they prop up Dan Z, and that's not something that I am comfortable with for producer guy Dan at this point, letting him be right about something as petty as peaches and cream. We'll continue to try and figure that one out. The Celtics a lot less hard to figure out at this point. Last night, 19 three-pointers made in the course of that game, took 39, so shot 48% from three over the course of that game. Pretty much all their starters outside of Gerald Green, who shouts to him for the goose egg. Someone's got to drag down the average a little bit. But everyone else, Jay Crowder, 24 points last night. Al Horford, 21 points last night. And Al Horford seems to be a guy at different times this year, for as much as this is Isaiah Thomas's team, when you can get performances like that out of a guy who is a mobile big the way Al Horford is, the way they've paid him in accordance with someone you expect to go out and produce, not getting rebounds and doing the other things that he's certainly done along the way, but scoring at a clip like this.
Horford had 9 in the fourth last night, and he was a rebound shy of a triple-double. I mean, he took that game over late. He said, this is, my game to win, and he delivered. He earned those $113 million last night.
And I'm sure there's a lot of fans going, well, yeah, no duh. It's certainly about time.
First and last.
So we've spawned off into a couple of weird side debates here. The first one is Dan not understanding that peaches and cream is, in fact, a saying, the way Isaiah Thomas used it last night. Do we have that sound just for context for people here?
We know it's not going to be, I guess, peaches and cream all the time.
So there you go. Isaiah Thomas making peaches and cream a thing again. Twitter was quick to point out Draymond Green also used it in the finals last year. Dan Z seems to be the only one, producer guy Dan, oblivious to the fact that this is a thing. It's also a song by 112.
Up to 85 votes, Twitter still agrees with me. It's not always peaches and cream is not a phrase. I'm not disagreeing. Like, I've heard peaches and cream as a flavor. You're saying it's a song that means something totally different. I understand that it exists, but in the context of it's not always peaches and cream is not a phrase. It's not always rainbow and sunshine. That's a phrase.
I mean, it's
everything's not always coming up roses. That's a phrase.
And this is the weird part. So now you sound like an insane person. The staff is all decidedly against you. Ray Netchie, who is something that he's one of the guys above us on this show. He's one of our bosses, I guess, technically. I don't know Ray's title. But Ray texts in, and he agrees, peaches and cream.
Your boss is going to be so stoked to hear that description of him.
I'm sorry, Ray, I love you. I do. And I'm bringing it up because you're right, and you support my argument, which is that it's 100% a phrase. He completely buries Dan Z. I'm looking forward to the next text I get from Ray now. But this isn't even the, dumbest take that you've had during the break here. Your hottest one, and this is another weird side debate that's gotten spawned during the show, is the best Pop-Tart flavor. Someone was clearly not enthralled with our question about whether Paul Pierce should be a Hall of Famer or not. So they said this is a more worthwhile discussion, and I'd agree. I say brown sugar cinnamon is an easy Pop-Tart Hall of Famer. You could argue it's the best Pop-Tart. You say no, sir.
It's disgusting, and it's called cinnamon brown sugar, so you don't even know the name, so it can't be that good.
I mean, listen, just reorganizing those 3 words, change it at all in the description?
No, but it's a bad Pop-Tart. With all of the great Pop-Tart options, I told you, if there were a zombie apocalypse and a truck turned over with nothing but cinnamon brown sugar Pop-Tarts, I would consider passing.
But not only that, you said that the only way you'll eat them is what? Tell the world what you do to these Pop-Tarts in order to make them, in your mind, edible.
Yeah, if I were going to eat cinnamon brown sugar, as I did when I was a kid, every once in a while, if I was really, really desperate, the only way I could stomach it is you toast it, and then you put a little slice of butter on top and work that around. You get a little cinnamon brown sugar butter Pop-Tart.
So I need to know if this is a thing right now. 888-729-3776. Do you butter your Pop-Tarts? As I can hear the alarms going off in the heads of our bosses. And so we'll circle back to this in the peaches and cream debate in a little bit. But one thing that's not up for debate was how great a lot of the post-game sound was in the first round of the NBA playoffs. Fizdale out in Memphis leading the way with the how about that for data rant. You had Chris Paul, who last night was getting on a reporter, and that wasn't even his best version of that. You had the about that life debate that got spawned because of the Jimmy Butler and Marcus Smart beef. So without further ado, we've put together a little montage as we bid farewell to round 1 of the NBA playoffs and look back longingly at what was some unbelievable sound.
We don't get the respect that these guys deserve because Mike Conley doesn't go crazy. He has class, and he just plays the game. But I'm not going to let them treat us that way.
When I get on the floor, I got one friend, and that's the basketball. I've been like that since I was a little kid. My dad told me that when I was younger. Once you get on the floor, you got one friend, and the friend is Spalding.
Will the Clippers be back here Sunday playing a Game 7?
What?
Your feeling about, your level of confidence that you'll be back here again.
What you think? I'm on the team. What you want me to say? Nah, it's over. That's what you want to hear? Yes. Come on, man. You've been doing this long enough.
Jeremy has said last game, we can't let guys like Avery Bradley score 20. I usually don't say anything, and I just go out there and play hard, but I feel like every player should respect this game and respect the guys that go out there and prepare every single night. And I feel like I won the battle tonight. I took it personal.
When you look at your line on the box score, how would you grade the line?
I don't give a about the line. We lost.
We're not going to sit here and get in each other's faces like that. Like I said, he's not about that life, so he's calming down.
I know Pop's got pedigree and I'm a young rookie, but they're not going to rook us.
You guys have not played well at all when you've gone to the bench.
That's fine.
I'm just trying to figure out what's going on.
Russell, you ain't played well at all. Say Russell and the team haven't played well. Don't say when Russell goes out, the team don't play well. It don't matter. We in this together.
I ain't got to talk about what I am about. No, I just show you. I can show you better than I can tell you. I mean, last time I checked, if you're going to say something about that life, you should know, right?
But I've asked Steven a question. It's a legitimate question.
Next question.
It's a legitimate question.
Next question.
No, I think we're going to keep the microphone. I had a question for Steven, and it wasn't answered.
Next question, please.
Take that for data.
From a first round, we talk about all the time how full of stars the NBA is right now on the court as far as great players for the health and vitality of the league. You know, through the playoff, Giannis Antetokounmpo, his emergence was monstrous in a big, big way. We saw it during the regular season, but we know we wait postseason performance, and for him, it was a big coming out party there. But if you really look at the stars that were left in the playoffs, him and Kawhi Leonard are about the only ones that we didn't hear from in a soundbite. Everyone else was more than willing and more than giving of their time behind the mic when it came down to it. I mean, look at the names that you heard going off of there. Russell Westbrook, who's never been shy about this to begin with, gave this a couple. Spalding, his version of Wilson, the only friend he needs in the world. Getting up there and trying not to divide, or let the reporters, I should say, let the media divide his team. But I have to think, throughout this playoff run, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but the biggest star power mover and shaker was David Fizdale. Like going forward, coming out of this now, a name and a market that before we probably wouldn't have paid as much attention to, although I will say the Grindhouse might be the best name for a home arena in all of sports, let alone just the NBA. He's got to come out this looking better than almost anyone from that first round, right?
I'd have to agree with that. Fizdale stole the show just with everything he did.
Yeah, it's everything about that, because it was just short of being a rant, but it was enough to where it was basically the beginning and end of our montage there. And rightly so. I'm going to miss it. Hopefully the second round delivers in that way.
First and last, the podcast.
The NFL draft wrapped up over the weekend. Since we left you guys on Friday, obviously everything after the first round had occurred for a lot of different teams. Had a lot of draft recap and grades already, which I understand it's the process we have to go through, but we're also a long time away from the payoff on a lot of these situations with a lot of these players as far as the on-the-field value that they're going to bring to certain teams. You talk about draft winners and losers. Overall, though, a lot of people will point to the job that John Lynch did, especially in the first round with the 49ers and bringing some talent in there. The Cleveland Browns executing their draft strategy pretty well this year, getting a lot of the players that they coveted, not reaching for a quarterback in the first round the way we so often associated with them. They did get Deshaun Kaiser in the second round. We'll wait and see how he factors in. But another storyline of the NFL draft this weekend was a lot of the players that going into it, whether it was Joe Mixon in years prior and his issue of assault that had come up and been such a story throughout the draft process of what it would mean for his draft status, whether it was Caleb Brantley from Florida, who had the accusation for him, the charge leading up to the draft much more recently, D.D. Westbrook going to the Jacksonville Jaguars, who has a history of some accusations of his own, all of which came up and all of which begged the question about what this looks like now when not only these players are being given a shot but being drafted, and especially for Joe Mixon's case, he was a second-round draft pick. Now, this is a guy that was talked about in the realm of first-round talent, but is going to be a visible portion of this franchise. I mean, they have press conferences for second-round draft picks. coming out of this, and there are already some people that have taken exception to this. You look at ESPN 1530 in Cincinnati, Mo Egger there from that station talks about how he feels conflicted about this pick for the Cincinnati Bengals.
Now that he's here, I don't think it does anybody any good for him not to take advantage of the second chance. But, man, there is an overwhelming part of me that just wishes that wasn't happening here.
And it becomes like that for a lot of fans who are now forced to, in very public ways, question this. And we saw this happen, I mean, God, with Aroldis Chapman and the Chicago Cubs. I remember our own Sarah Spain, huge Cubs fan, having to kind of publicly digest some of those feelings about how I reconcile rooting for the team that I love and care about when I know that a prominent feature on their roster represents a lot of things that I really disagree with and are obviously just inherently awful things. But we've got that notion of second chances that comes up. And with Joe Mixon, that's been part of this offseason, is the idea that he was punished at Oklahoma, and the video resurface recomplicates things in weird ways for me. The fact that people always seem to need that video reassurance of what we know happened to feel the proper outrage. But regardless, that's there, and that's something that's going to be dealt with. But are a lot of these teams even capable of dealing with it in that way? I mean, you look at the Cincinnati Bengals in particular. We are not that far removed from the blow-up involving Pac-Man Jones in the locker room around their first set of OTAs. That's a guy who's had repeated off-the-field issues that don't seem to have been remedied by the locker room structure or the structure of that organization being in place to help him out. We know there's been some volatility in a more on-the-field sense. I'm not going to compare a lot of the things that Vontaze Burfict has gone through to anything in this situation because that's not fair to him. But just as far as what we always hear from these teams is that we want to provide these guys with the structure and the means to be better while they also help our football team, because that's what this is really all about. I mentioned the Jaguars taking D.D. Westbrook. The Jaguars GM David Caldwell discussed why he felt comfortable making that pick in the first place.
Well, charges were dropped, and so there was no charges. Never involved in anything. 2013 was the last one, so we felt like that stuff was behind him.
This kid's what convinced you, though, like maturity? I mean, in the interview, did he seem like he's
maturity. I mean, you look at 17, 18-year-old kid, maybe 19 at the time, but we've all made mistakes, and I've said this before. It's we evaluate everything, but in terms of being judged, I think he'll eventually be judged, and it won't be by us. So.
And I know this is in the larger course of a press conference discussing things, but it just seems like at times, are even these GMs not really equipped to discuss this in the way they should for being the faces of the organizations?
Is there anything worse than we've all made mistakes as just such a throwaway, dismissive line of anything anyone's done wrong?
Well, I think I saw even a quote of his. Oh, we've got another quote of David Caldwell, and another just sort of, I think, flippant portion of this conversation from him.
I think we've done our due diligence enough to realize that's behind them, and that that, like we said, all those charges are dropped. So I think we've all been accused of things, and have things. Maybe not all of us, but many of us have been accused of things. But we don't take it lightly. Obviously, it's a serious issue, and we just feel like that at this point in time is to give a chance to make right.
Like, man, you just like that, like. To say we don't take this lightly right after that chuckle and we've all been accused of things line, that just can't happen. Like that cannot happen. And for all the media training that players and everyone on that side goes through, you would think that the people that are more often than not asked to go up and answer for so many of the questions about the organization would be better prepared for a guy that they clearly had on their draft board, were comfortable enough to make that pick and bring in. And instead walk up there and it seems like are just flying by the seat of their pants. It makes absolutely no sense to me, but it begs that larger question of, are these organizations really as equipped to handle these things as they present to us? And my answer would probably be no in a lot of cases, but they're out there trying to justify the fact that they've got a guy that they know they could get for cheaper who can help out their football team in a big way. And that level of honesty would almost be appreciated. That we know this guy can help our football team. We're going to try our best. We don't know if that's good enough. Is that going to be good enough for NFL fans? I don't know. Do we hit a point where having these guys around the way it was made so clear with Greg Hardy and others wasn't palatable, and that's why those guys are out of the league?
First and last.
This weekend in the NFL draft, one of the other stories that came up along the way was the fact that the Buffalo Bills went through, actually had, by most accounts, a pretty good draft. I saw they put out the draft ratings for after Mel Kiper and the gang there rate the performance of these teams, and most people gave the Buffalo Bills an A- range for their draft. They only had 6 picks, but they made them count. Got Tre'Davious White from LSU, Zay Jones, the productive wide receiver from East Carolina, Deion Dawkins, the guard from Temple that's probably going to be able to step in and play right away. Nate Peterman, a late-round quarterback, a guy that a lot of people had climbing up draft boards later on in the process. So overall, a pretty strong haul. The problem is that now the guy who was in charge of bringing them all in and the staff that was in charge of bringing in all these guys is no longer there in Buffalo. The Buffalo Bills, after the draft weekend, fired their GM, Doug Whaley, on Sunday. Now, from the outside looking in, you can say, all right, in 4 seasons with Whaley as the GM, the Bills were 30-34. Their postseason drought is still at 17 seasons. Their only winning season under him was when the Bills were 9-7, and they still missed the playoffs that year. They were 7-9 last year in 2016. And so you look at that, and like our own ESPN NFL Nation reporter Mike Rodak says, not particularly shocking when you think about it in that light that Doug Whaley's been fired.
This was expected, I'd say, for the last couple of months. That was the direction this thing was headed after it became very clear that Sean McDermott, who the Bills hired as their head coach in January, was the guy in Buffalo. It became very clear that he had a lot of sway over personnel decisions, that he had the ear of ownership, Terry and Kim Pagula, and that ownership very likely gave Sean McDermott what he wanted, which was a fresh, clean slate in the personnel department.
Which is very interesting to me. So Sean McDermott came over, was the defensive coordinator from the Carolina Panthers, and by all accounts was the guy that Doug Whaley went out and handpicked. He was given the power to go out and find his head coach that apparently would ultimately usurp him in this whole process, but was gone out and found that. And so in the offseason still sounded as if Doug Whaley and that scouting division, all of which was wiped from the face of the earth on Sunday in Buffalo, were given the power to go out and draft these players. Now, again, it sounds like Sean McDermott had some hand in that, but even he was up in front of the microphone praising the job that he did. The timing of this, just to me, does feel strange now, given all of that context, and Mike Rodak also talked about that.
Ideally, if the Bills had done this right, which, again, they don't often do these things right. That's kind of what has plagued this team for so many years. If they had done things right, they most likely would have fired Doug Whaley after the season, right along with Rex Ryan, and just started fresh from there. So there wasn't this dragged-out situation as we saw over the last couple months when Doug Whaley was not talking to reporters. We have not spoken to Doug Whaley since the Senior Bowl in January. He was not put out for the pre-draft press conference. He was not introducing the draft picks. He was not in the photo with the first-round draft pick. So all these things where he traditionally had been seen and been heard from, he was not there.
That's never good when you hear the Buffalo Bills rarely handle these things right, because if you are a fan, you are looking at this and saying, all right, you just let somebody else buy the groceries, gave them to your coach, and now all of a sudden have removed that piece from the equation and are going to, in theory, now bring someone else in who has a bunch of players that they didn't have any hand in bringing to the organization, who has a coach that they didn't have any hand in bringing to the organization, and who has to probably look at that spot and say, how am I going to feel empowered in this situation where it's been made very clear who was calling the shots here? who is given the opportunity and who's clearly, as he mentioned there, has the ear of ownership in a way that was able to get these things done. So for Buffalo early, coming off this draft weekend, one that should have, again, on paper, given people a lot of things to be excited about for this team, you end up looking at it and saying, what does the future of this organization really look like? We dealt with the questions about Tyrod Taylor's future there all offseason and what you've got at the quarterback position. And now this. You couple that with, this weekend, the Chicago Bears, who we've got reports out there we know gave up a bunch, the subject of a lot of mockery as far as getting got by John Lynch, the new kid on the block, out in San Fran, wheeling and dealing on his first draft. Trading up, though, to get the guy that they think could be their quarterback of the future, and Mitchell Trubisky from North Carolina. And he was a guy that had climbed further and further up draft boards throughout the process, had the big postseason skyrocketing as far as his draft status went there. Now all of a sudden we get reports. So it's one thing if you see that trade on the surface and think, because by all accounts it was a bad trade just in the fact that they probably could have got that. But if they got scared that another team was going to trade up with San Francisco, if they believed enough of the smokescreen that had been put out there that San Francisco might even have entertained thoughts of taking Trubisky, the phrase, there's no price too great to give up if you believe you're getting a franchise guy at quarterback, which again, based off Mike Glennon getting all that money this offseason, there's not a need to even see the payoff of this right away. You can give Mitchell Trubisky a chance to sit if you feel so inclined there in Chicago and allow him to grow and develop, since this is a guy who only has 13 starts under his belt at the college level. The problem is now the reports that we have coming out that head coach John Fox wasn't consulted, wasn't brought in on this process, didn't know that the team was going to go after Mitchell Trubisky. So now you've got Ryan Pace, the GM there, younger guy, John Fox, the old guard, the football guy is your head coach, who are seemingly at odds about this, and it puts them in an uncomfortable situation. And what John Fox weighed in his thoughts on the Bears draft in general here after the draft.
Well, I think, anytime you earn the currency of the third pick in the draft, obviously it's really exciting. I think the further you pick to the top, quote, the better players you get. So I was very pleased with how the draft went, very pleased with the guys we got. I don't know that we met all our needs. I think that's impossible when you're rebuilding like we are, but very pleased with all the players we got.
And the architect of that rebuilding process, GM Ryan Pace, will be joining Mike and Mike in the 9 a.m. hour today to talk about, I'm sure, some of these reports that this decision was made without the knowledge of the head coach, John Fox, there, who now could potentially be tasked with tutoring a quarterback that he didn't exactly want. Maybe he didn't believe in at that point. And it just gets dicey. We saw how that worked out with Bill O'Brien and the Houston Texans last year. We saw how that was the story with the Browns going into this weekend, was would they take Mitchell Trubisky at number one when it was made very clear that Hugh Jackson was not buying into him, the quarterback guru that he is, as dialed into that spot. But the Browns, oddly enough, made the proper executive decision to say, all right, we're going to use our analytics department in conjunction with our football guy and make the right decision here. It seems the Bears have decided to go an entirely different route, and it just never seems like if you've got those two portions, especially your head coach and your GM, at odds, that the result can ever be anything but disaster. But we'll wait and see, because like I said, the payoff for Mitchell Trubisky and that really big portion of this conversation seems to be a ways away. We did tease this before, though. We do owe our good friend Hockey Guy something coming off of this weekend. But without further ado, this one's for you.
This one's for you, Hockey Guy.
Chopped up the center. Here's a 2-on-1. Peugeot. Wingles. Peugeot. Scores! J.G. Peugeot! Oh, my heavens. A 4-goal night, and he absolutely paralyzes. 1 point. 4 for number 44.
Ovechkin center point, a shot off the stick of Mata over the head of Fleury. They must get to it, and Cullen up to Jake Gensel. Got a chance for the empty netter. There it goes. It's in. and Gensel will score yet another one. And the Penguins have sent Elvis right out of this building.
Here comes pass down the right wing. Shoveled toward McLeod. And in the net! Cody McLeod driving the net. Tips it home. Predators take a 2-0 lead at 2:29.
And the puck is played by Silverberg. A shot deflected. Score! Oh, big one there for Ryan Kessler. After Silverberg got the puck near the blue line, turned, fired it, deflected off Kessler's stick. Kessler gets it, 6-3 Anaheim.
TSN 1200, 105.9 The X, 102.5 The Game, and KLAA. A big weekend, a lot of goals in the action. Pittsburgh jumps out to a 2-0 lead in the series over the Caps, drumming 6-2. I know, sadly, for a few guys on the staff here, the Rangers down 0-2 right now to the Senators here. You guys holding up okay?
Yeah, I wonder if the NHL's holding up okay, because they don't want Ottawa in the conference final whatsoever.
No. That becomes the other part of this. We always talk about who's best for the entertainment product of the league, and you're right, that would certainly be the much more compelling model. And then you look at the games from yesterday, Nashville up 2-1 now in the series on St. Louis with a 3-1 in there, and then Anaheim stealing one against Edmonton. Edmonton still up 2-1 in that series. You mentioned the star power and what's best for the league. Connor McDavid moving on would seem to fit that need there. So an exciting weekend in the NHL as well. That'll continue today with 7:30 p.m. Eastern, Pittsburgh and Washington.
Thank you for listening to the First and Last podcast. You can listen and subscribe to all ESPN podcasts in the Listen tab of the ESPN app. First and Last.